Good morning, Daniel.
Morning, Dan.
What are we chatting about today?
Let's chat about if staying at a job you don't enjoy is worth the cost. Explore some non traditional and maybe purpose driven work paths, and then jobs that offer meaningful benefits beyond pay in the paycheck.
Welcome to the Science of Wealth, where we discuss the science behind financial planning and the art of learning and applying it. Well, gee, Daniel, are you not happy here? What have we done to prompt such a topic?
No, it's just, one of the topics comes up and then I try to think of things that are related. So then, I end up going down the path of just jobs and careers and whatnot. And I also think it's just fascinating. So I like talking about it. So I wanted to start off talking about if staying at a job you don't enjoy is worth the cost. And I think you can make an argument for both sides here. But for context, right, this is kind of how I came up with the topic. I was hanging out with a couple friends on a Sunday night recently, and we all had work on Monday. And, it's 8 o'clock at night. We're all getting up to leave. And someone just starts talking about, oh, I hate Mondays. We have work tomorrow and whatnot. And everybody else kind of hems and haws about their job and how much it sucks and how they can't wait for it to be over, even though it hasn't started yet. And I know that, some people just say that kind of out of habit, like, oh, I hate Mondays and whatnot. I've never really felt that way. I also can empathize with the fact that, I might be a little robotic and that I just, show up, do the thing and leave. And then that's that. But it was pretty weird, because I don't have a lot of friends like that don't like what they do and seriously dread, 5 out of 7 days of the week. I think the one side of it is, right, when they say, what should I do? It's like, get a new job. If it's really that miserable and you hate your life that much, get a new job. But conversely, right, I think of, a couple friends I have that are just in entry-level positions where they're doing all the grunt work that people don't like to do. So they don't like their job right now, but they like the opportunity it might give them and how it might project them into better opportunities later in their career. So I kind of just wanted to talk about, walking that tightrope between like, I'm miserable, this isn't going to get any better, versus like, this is a cost right now that I have to incur in order to get a payoff later. That's not really a question. I think it's just more of a kind of a conversation.
Yeah, I think it's interesting. If we want to think about this in financial planning terms, it really is a discount question, right? How much or how heavily do we discount happiness versus compensation, essentially, right? Just to boil it down to a two-factor analysis. Putting that in plain English, how much money is misery worth, or unhappiness worth, or boredom worth, or whatever it is that makes your job uncomfortable? And so when I think about it in those terms, I really look at it and say, like, look, there are some professions that are kind of famously miserable, some jobs that are sort of famously miserable, and people do them, right? Like, I don't think somebody who works, 110 hours a week in oil fields does it because they just really love getting dirty, right? And being out in the middle of nowhere in Texas or Alaska or North Dakota. They do it because the money is really good. People don't dig ditches for fun. They do it because the money is worth it to them. So to some extent, I look at it and just say, when you have a job that pays you adequately, but you're unhappy, the question that then arises is there a lesser amount of money that could, be acceptable, and we could then be happy making a lesser amount of money with the work or the type of work or the job or the company or whatever it is? Or is it not a problem that can be solved by compensation?
I think that's interesting because I know I have a couple clients, right, in like, I'd call them high intensity industries, right? They work a lot, clearly, and they get paid fairly well for it. And a couple of them I've noticed a trend of them saying, well, I'll work a lower paying job, lower stress, right? And then they come back 6 months later and say, well, actually, I kind of looked into it, and the job that paid half as much was still like 75% of the stress, I think, right? And maybe it isn't worth it. Like, that kind of seems like a tough trade-off to make at a certain point, because now you're making, great money. And when you look to get paid less, it doesn't actually dollar for dollar, come with like incrementally less stress. It still is more stressful than I think a lot of people hoped. At least that's the observation it seems some clients have made. Does that still make it worth it? Or you think at that point you're kind of just stuck where you are?
I'm reminded of that expression, the grass is always greener on the other side. And the corollary to that is sometimes grass is green because it's sprinkled in bullshit. when you look at that idea, right? Oh, if I took less money, I'd have less stress, or I'd be happier. Again, like whatever the problem is, it would be solved in this role that pays less. The challenge is that you may just be trading one stressor for another, right? Maybe your job is less stressful, but maybe now the comp is not, commensurate to the degree of stress. As you highlight, right? 50% comp, 75% stress doesn't seem like a good trade-off. And we're simplifying here, but I think there's a balance here where we have to look at it and say, okay, what is the actual cause of your dislike? Because part of it could be something as simple as like, I'm working 60-hour weeks and I want to work 60-hour weeks. I want to get a job where I'm guaranteed not to work 60-hour weeks. Okay, that's reasonably diagnosable. It's reasonably straightforward. But what if it's, I don't really love the work anymore? I'll use attorneys as a good example of this. Attorneys often rank in like the top 3 most unhappy professions. And for a lot of them, it's a fairly simple diagnosis. I went to a very expensive grad school. I have huge student loans, and now I have to work in a profession that often bills hourly, and I'm working as part of a law firm that's requiring me to bill 30, 40 hours a week, meaning that I have to put in 60, 70 hours a week to do it. And, I'm working on like the mergers and acquisitions of like a pharmaceutical company and like a small regional chemical distributor. And I am so bored, I just want to die. And that's a problem. It's a hard cycle to break. There are fields of law you might be happier in. Maybe you want to work in human rights law or immigration law, or you want to, do nonprofit, purpose-driven law, but the comp isn't enough to then make ends meet. And so you end up being trapped. So I think it becomes a question again of how diagnosable is the cause of the misery, and does a job change or a role change or a deliberate demotion or lateral move in your career actually solve the core problem that's making you unhappy?
Do you find with folks you've had these conversations with that there usually is a diagnosable problem that's fixable? Or like, I know people that just are complainers, right? It doesn't matter what they're actually doing, they're probably going to find the negative in it. Or do you find like for the most part, when a client has this conversation with you, it's easy to identify what the issue is and how to kind of fix it?
I think it's it's very individualized. I think there's a general category of just like people who are just sort of done working. They're just like, look, I used to have the energy and the passion and the enthusiasm, and now I'm really just showing up for a paycheck. And if I didn't have to show up for a paycheck, I wouldn't show up. And, that's sort of a fair enough position, right? I think it's perfectly okay to be the type of person who says, I work to live, not live to work. Not everybody is blessed to work in a field, an industry, an occupation where they can just feel deep passion and like feel the impact and feel the meaningfulness. Being sympathetic to that, I think it then feeds back into your question of, is it, are some things more or less diagnosable? I think at the end of the day, it becomes a question of, really, we like to ask this question, right? If money wasn't the issue or the object, how would you want to spend your time? And for a lot of people, the answer would not involve anything they'd spend the majority of their time on.
That's a good point. And we've seen some clients make some interesting transitions. I think about that from time to time and like the financial impact of doing that thing, right? Say, I'll make up an example. You're a software engineer and you just want to make candles, right? And you make this huge transition, whatever the thing is. Do you think a lot of folks underestimate the financial flexibility they actually have to make a change, or are just scared to take the jump? Or do you think it's more just like a lifestyle thing and less of a money thing?
I think there's a bit of a barbell here, because we see this in clients around like the retirement discussion, right? We see people who could retire right now, and we see people who are not close to it. And there's a healthy middle tranche here where we see people who are going to be on a quick trajectory to retire early, but they're not quite there yet. But like they've done all the right things, right? We often have a strong client population of people who like really dug into like saving and investing in their 20s and 30s, and now they're in their mid-late 40s and like they're cruising to retirement at this point. I think when you run into the question then of do we have the flexibility or not to make the change? I'm actually reminded of Fight Club in a strange sense. There's this Tyler Durden moment where he says your possession you start to own your possessions and your possessions begin to own you, and we see that in lifestyle, right? Like we have a joke as financial planners: anybody in America can retire as long as you're willing to live in a cardboard box. And the challenge with that in practice is look, retirement is just a formula. I have a certain quality of life. That quality of life is measured in a financial cost. and I need to sufficiently fund that cost. And so if you are willing to cut back, if you're willing to be flexible in your how much you eat out, what kind of car you drive, how big of a house you live in, etc., you have a lot more optionality around these things. But if you live in a $1 million house with a 30-year mortgage at 6.5%, and you've got 2 kids that you want to send to college, and your spouse only works part-time as it is, and so on, you're going to find yourself in a position where your decisions here are highly constrained by the financial considerations, unless you're willing to make sacrifices elsewhere. And a lot of financial planning decisions come down to a lever pulling exercise. Work longer, earn more, spend less, save more, get better returns, right? And we can kind of decide which levers we want to push and pull, but the one inevitable thing here is time, right? The passage of time is going to come whether we like it or not. And so we have to be mindful that these end up being often mutually exclusive decisions where one choice we make now is going to eliminate other choices later.
Do you think there's like a age consideration here too, where if somebody tells you they hate their job, they hate their career, whatever the thing is, but they're in their 40s versus maybe in their 20s, you approach the conversation differently?
I think the only part of the conversation that I approach here is not like it's never a you're too old to make a change. That's not the issue. It's that I think some people, the further along they get in their life and their career, the more successful they've been, have a hard time accepting that their value proposition is highly niche dependent, right? Like let's say I am a really senior engineer. I can build bridges. I can design a skyscraper. Like I can do it all. And I'm worth, $250,000 a year, right? That's huge. That's valuable. It's incredible. But if I then say, you know what, I'm tired of being an engineer. I want to go and teach math in a high school. It doesn't matter that you had 20, 30 years of experience as an engineer. The value of your job at this school is the value of your job at that school. And you're going to get a pay scale that reflects that. So it's just something where you have to be really mindful of the fact that sometimes when you want to make a change, it's easier to do it earlier in life because you're not so far down the path and you don't have the same compensation and seniority. But, financial planners are a good example of this. A lot of people become financial planners as career changes in their 30s and 40s. And a lot of people have a hard time doing it because entry level rate is, depending where you are in the country, $45,000 to $65,000. And a lot of people were making $120,000, $150,000, $200,000 being a software developer, so they're doing something else in their life. And being asked to reset to $50,000, $60,000 a year is just a big bite out of their lifestyle, and it's hard to do.
All right, so let's talk about that aspect of it, because I think that's kind of topic number 2 is this follow your passion or pursue a non-traditional work path per se. So if somebody is making $250,000 a year and maybe their passion is teaching math at the local high school, I think that's interesting, right? Because not all passions are profitable, and some of them are, but maybe not to the within your expectations. Some people also work for nonprofits, which notoriously don't pay as much as for-profit businesses. And some people like to volunteer or just pursue freelancing, independent contracting, and some of these other things. Do you think that the blanket advice of follow your passion tends to pay out in the long term? Because you love the thing, you're going to work more in the thing, be more successful at the thing, compared to like doing something, as you said, like just for the paycheck, just for the money.
I think this is where the Japanese concept of ikigai is quite applicable, right? Ikigai is often visualized as a Venn diagram overlap of 5 things. Something you're passionate about, something you're good at, something the world needs, and something you can get paid for. And if you can find all 4 of those things, that's sort of kind of your personal career life satisfaction nirvana. A lot of people are doing 2 of 4 or 3 of 4. Some sad people are stuck in 1 of 4, and that's really tough. But in that sense, right, it's this idea of if your passion is the thing that the world needs and you're good at it and you can get paid for it, terrific, right? And this is the quintessential rock star, right? You're a good musician. The world likes entertainment. People are willing to pay for it, and you love music. Well, great. But that's sort of the challenge here is a lot of follow your passion things are not fiscally feasible. I think, though, at the same time, one of the most interesting things about sort of the advent of influencer culture and influencer careers is that there are people making a living like opening boxes on camera. You're just like, oh, I bought the iPhone. Let's unpack the iPhone. And I don't know why that's their passion, and I don't know why 10 million people watch that video and they get all the ad revenue, but they do. So it's an interesting thing where I always have sort of a conservative, like, let's be mindful of how like financially feasible your passion is. But life is full of these odd and curious little surprises.
Do you find that those conversations, in your experience, tend to be more seeking out a specific lifestyle or running away from like the other thing? Like more of a push or a pull, I guess.
It's interesting, I zoom out a little bit and look at entrepreneurs in particular. I find a lot of the best entrepreneurs, a lot of the best small businesses are the result of somebody being good at something and people just steadily accumulating a desire. Take the E-Myth example of the pie maker, right? The whole, metaphor, the whole story here is, this person makes great pies, and then people want to pay them for their pies. Then they start making more pies, and people, the word gets out this person's a great pie maker. So then they eventually have to hire somebody who just like handles selling the pies while they make the pies. And then the volume gets to be too much. They have to get a commercial kitchen, and they have to hire other people to help them make pies. And fast forward 20 years down the road, they run a pie factory, right? And they don't personally make pies anymore, and they find themselves sort of unhappy because they got into this because they liked making pie. The sort of question here then of like, are you being pulled to something, or are you running away from something? Again, I think you see very successful businesses based on demand for what people do, and that's a poll example. But I see a lot of people just decide they don't want to be employees, they don't want to work for somebody else. I think the challenge is, and I'll use my wife as a good example of this, is sometimes she has a normal 9-to-5 40-hour week job, but she also loves making stained glass and doing creative things, and she's now started to build this stuff and all of that. And like she's like, I just want to make glass, and people can buy glass, and it's great, and it's fun, and it's beautiful. And she hates the business owner part of that. Like she hates bookkeeping, she hates having to pay sales tax, she hates all of those parts. And it's like, unfortunately, sometimes the running away from is not overwhelmed by the realities of what it's like on the other side. Again, back to the grass is greener and being sprinkled with bullshit. Sometimes what we're running away from wasn't as bad as what we've run to.
I think that's pretty wise, and I think that's not really a financial consideration when you leave for a purpose project, but like it is a consideration. Like, do you like all aspects of it? Because if you're going to make it your job, right, there's more than just doing the thing. I guess what specific financial items would you encourage somebody to consider if they're thinking about this themselves, whether it's following a passion or a calling, or even if it's just, look, I work 50 hours a week, I want to work 10 and just do consulting and do something adjacent to what I do right now.
I mean, the first one is going to be obvious, but it's runway, right? How much money do we have to survive on before this can break even or needs to break even? And that can be measured in weeks, months, years. I've written about and I've shared before, right? When I started as a financial planner, I had a whole $5,000 saved to do that. And that was not adequate in the slightest. And there were problems caused by that, where, for the first several years, it was a very stressful financial environment to sort of boom and bust in credit card debt and getting it paid off and then having to accumulate again and so on. So runway is just really key. You do need to really build that up quite a bit. And then you need to understand what your out is, right? Because sometimes moving away from 9-to-5, 40-hour week work to pursue your passions, it doesn't have to be perfectly economically viable, right? Like you saved enough for retirement. You're on, let's say, Coast Fire is a popular term, where you don't really need to save anymore to be able to retire at some point. You just need to get older, essentially. But in that same dynamic, there's a question here of, okay, if you're retiring to something, if you're making a life change, a career change, whatever it is, how can you pivot if it doesn't work, right? If your assumptions prove false, like you followed your passions, you want to be a painter, and you had 18 months of runway to be a painter, and you're at month 19. What is your pivot? What options are available to you? I think that is the other consideration here. Beyond the runway is, if it fails, if it doesn't work out, what is going to work for you? I mean, we can look at even you right now and what you're starting to work on in your own career.
Sure. Yeah. I mean, I think a lot of people like to just think of the plan A, if it works out, what that looks like, etc. But I think you also have to employ a healthy dose of pragmatism into okay, well, what is the worst case scenario? What if this thing doesn't work out? What's the pivot? What's the alternative? Or what am I going to do? Just because you want it to work out and you want things to pay doesn't mean they necessarily will. And depending on what that is, whether it's like something you're doing more out of passion, or it's your actual career and you're just taking a pivot maybe toward more of like a consulting or a part-time job, I think those are worth considering. I think the part you brought up there I thought was interesting too, is like you said 9-to-5, 40 hours a week, right? And like usually that kind of relates to like 40 year work week, right? Or work years, right? So you work from 22, 23 to 65 essentially, right? Like do you think that's becoming less of the norm in subsequent generations? Like I think we see a lot more people aiming to retire. You said like Coast Fire, right? Like retire pre-65 and live their life, and retire earlier. Like, do you think that's something we're going to continue to see more and more of, or do you think it's more of just a small subsection of the population?
I don't have any real data on this, so this is more me musing on your question than being able to articulate. Oh, like here's the facts and figures. We've seen a trend. I think it's become more visible than it used to be, and I say that because let's rewind like the 1960s. You had a whole generation of people, pardon my French here, sort of just like fucking off for a while, right? Not working, not pursuing their careers, not pursuing their education. And I'm sure their parents thought that they were all going to end up like dead in a ditch, and some probably did end up dead in a ditch, but most of them grew up to be the boomers, right? One of the most entrepreneurially successful, economically successful generations in world history. I think there's a visibility to it now where the internet, we have these like travel influencers, we have these video bloggers, we have these people who are not living a traditional life and are making a living or making it obvious that they do something different. I think we also have to keep in mind two factors here, though. One is survivorship bias, right? That person who says like, I retired from my rat race corporate job to like consult on the weekends. They might have had great connections, great relationships, right place, right time, one big client that pays all their bills sort of thing that made that possible. And we on the outside look at them just like, well, Josh over here is only working 10 hours a week. Like he did it, so can I. But that's something that, again, we don't see what's actually happening. We're just making assumptions. The other thing is, and I look at this sort of as a bemused observation of privilege, which is the majority of Americans are not in a great position to handle their financial well-being long term, right? Like you look at studies that show how much the average savings are by people in their 20s, their 30s, their 40s, their 50s, right? The average person going into retirement has less than $100,000 saved. Like there's a lot of things that suggest that the 40-hour, or 40-year, work life is not only adequate, but actually almost necessary for a lot of people. And so you and I as financial planners, we tend to work with people experiencing abundance, where early retirement is possible, where, getting to quit or having one working member of the household is normal. And so in that context, I think we may see more of that. But I think that's actually just a reflection of the fact that we tend to work with a more affluent part of the population. The part where I'm really bemused, though, is there's just this interesting sort of bohemian person out there. And they're not doing super well financially, but there is, and we all know this person, we've all seen this person. There's that person who, in your life, where you're like, I don't know how they, like, make a living. Like, I don't know how they survive exactly. Like, they seem to be fine. They're always up, like, grabbing a coffee, having a beer. They never complain about money. But, like, I think their job is they work 4 hours a week as a barista, and I'm not clear how they, like, pay their rent or their mortgage or their bills. And they could have an inheritance. They could have, money saved that we just don't know about. They could just be on a sabbatical as a part of their life. Like, there's a whole bunch of ways that could happen. But that's always a segment that I look at and go, like, when you ask about 40 years, they're clearly, like, ignoring the 40 years. And I'm not sure how they're doing it. I think case by case, there's easy explanations. But I do think it's sort of an interesting question. At the end of the day, work is going to take up a huge portion of the time in your life. We come back to your original topic. I think it is beneficial and wonderful to care about and enjoy what you do, if it's possible for you.
Okay, and let's say you're talking to a young professional and they're navigating this decision between, purpose and what they're doing versus just the stability of something that actually pays the bills. Would you essentially just boil that down to, does the thing make money or not? Or is there more nuance in like, hey, you're young. If it doesn't work, you can just pivot in 2 years once you run out of money or something. Like, how would you approach it? I think it's different with somebody who's young and maybe has 40 years of runway and can make more mistakes than somebody who's 45 with kids they want to send to college and a spouse and a mortgage and whatnot.
I think one of the best things a young person can do is go find people doing the thing they think they want to do who are happy with it and who are unhappy with it. And sometimes that's easier or harder to do. I think, for example, if you say, like, I want to be a teacher, can I find a teacher who's unhappy, like, with the pay and benefits and life of being a teacher? Yeah, there are plenty of teachers who are not happy being teachers. There's also plenty of teachers who are overjoyed, but it's a path that has famously financial challenges, and you work a lot more than just the hours that school is in session. And if you teach English, you spend a lot of weekends reading 20 essays instead of getting to spend your free time doing what you want, and so on. But I think it's beneficial to really ask somebody who's been there and done it. and to get perspectives. There's always going to be somebody who says like, this is the best job ever. And there's always going to be somebody who says, I wish I'd done anything else. And I think it's meaningful to really hear them, right? Not just, talk to them and check a box and say, well, I talked to 5 teachers and they were really happy about it and one wasn't. I think it's more meaningful to really listen and understand why they enjoy it or why they dislike it, and to understand, what they would do differently if they say they do something differently, and contextualizing the rest of your life. I think one of the unfair realities we are just forced to live with is the general linear progression of time, right? You hear this observed in the spirit of like, man, it's so unfair that we make, young high school kids make really important decisions that are going to affect them for the rest of their lives. And it's like, yeah, but time only goes one direction as far as we can experience as human beings so far. So unfortunately, they're just going to have to do that. And so the due diligence can't be understated or underrated as a valuable thing, because at the end of the day, if you can make a strong commitment to go to the right schools, to get the right education, to find the right career for you, not just because you're interested in the subject matter, but because you've really done the homework on what it is to be a lawyer, to be a doctor, to be a teacher, whatever it is, I think that is a very meaningful thing to do, so that you can ideally find the right fit sooner in life or earlier in life and reap the benefits of that, versus trying something out because you really kind of wandered into it for 10 or 20 years, realizing you're miserable, and then trying to figure out how you reset or pivot from that later in life when it's harder to do it.
Yeah, and I see my friends, right? Like they're 25 to 30 years old, right? Similar to me, and some of them are absolutely miserable. But like at the same time, do you think some of it is just like us overthinking it a little bit? Like, do you think there's a degree of you can just fall in love with something you end up being good at, right? When you're early in your career, you don't have any knowledge, any experience, no recognition, right? No relationships. But over time, you accrue those things, even though you might not have liked it at first. Now that you start to have a little recognition, a little credibility, a little understanding of the thing, you just like it more. And if you stick it out long enough, you might like it. Like, I think you can like some things enough.
Yeah, I mean, it's interesting. There are actually studies on happiness that sort of measure happiness by tenure and age in different occupations. Like financial planners are a good example. Our happiness as financial planners just goes up and to the right, year over year, phase of career by phase of career, compensation. Everything is like a linear X equals Y relationship, where the older you get, the longer you've been doing it, the happier you are. And so to your question, right, like in certain occupations, yeah, you will just be happier do it the longer you do it, generally speaking. But that's not true of all occupations. So I think it's meaningful to also look at that and consider, hey, just imagine like working in nonprofits. Some people work their entire career in nonprofits and they're very happy and mission driven, but a lot of people burn out on nonprofits, within a couple of years, because the pay generally isn't that great. Because, you can say like, well, I want to cure cancer, or I want to help starving children, or I want to, build wells in Africa. But like, man, my personal needs, like my soul is really fulfilled, but my personal needs are really starting to drag on me. So it's something where I think it helps to recognize the curve over time and to really think long and hard about, hey, if I go work a job that pays 50% under market rate because I'm doing it for an NGO, or I'm doing it overseas, or whatever it is, what does that cost me personally, right? Is that costing me the ability to get married, to buy a home, to have children, all of the potential outcomes that could potentially drive. And I think it's a meaningful thing to really look at closely and be mindful of. And as you really contemplate, again, speaking to that young person, where you want to end up in life. And I'm all for, hey, suck it up, get through it. And I remember in the military, there was this expression of, be the change you want to see, because essentially everybody talks about being in the military like they're in prison. And then it's sort of like, well, if you want to be better, stay in. But like, it doesn't seem to work that way in practice. But all that to come around to like, look, tenure helps in a lot of places, but, life is too short to be miserable for the whole time you spend in it.
I think that's a good point about life being too short, especially when you don't know when your time comes up, right? I mean, if you spend 5 out of 7 days, say it all the time, like that's your life, right? You can't live for the weekends, at least in my opinion. I think that's a tough way to go about things. You mentioned, purpose-driven work, maybe things that aren't paying materially as well, but maybe your soul is fulfilled. So I think that kind of transitions to like meaningful benefits beyond a paycheck, right? And when you think about something like a nonprofit, you're not going to be paid nearly as much, but maybe the work itself, compensates you in other ways, and that's enough for you. When we think about benefits, right, I know we talk a lot about the material ones, right? You get your 401k match, it's got a certain vest to it. what's the health insurance, paid time off, commute to work, right? All these things. But there are benefits that show up that aren't on your pay stub. Things like your quality of life, right? Sense of purpose you actually have at work, long-term fulfillment. How do you weigh the benefits of those things versus the monetary benefits when you're looking for jobs, looking for careers, and whatnot?
I mean, at the end of the day, this actually kind of comes back to the first answer I gave in the first question, right? It's a discount rate question. And the trick here is, I think, early in your career, you're bad at that calculus. I'll use investment bankers as an example. Like, investment bankers famously work 90 to 110 hours a week. Everybody's famously miserable. People literally die of heart attacks under the age of 30 at their desks. Like, the stress is unbelievable. To this day, I'm still confused about how and why that job requires so much time and so much stress, but I don't work in investment banking, so I don't know what I'm talking about. But all of that to come around to, the people go into it knowing that. Like, it is famously brutal work-life balance, all of that. And they do it for the money because, and right out of school, a lot of six-figure jobs, and 3, 5, 10 years into the career, getting paychecks easily ramping up to $1 million plus, multi-million in some cases. You become a portfolio manager or something, you're talking about tens of millions a year. So like, they very clearly they do it for the money, right? And some people also just love it. Like, they love the game, they love the whole world of it. I don't think the executives at Goldman Sachs got there solely for the paycheck. I think they had to have some sort of passion or interest for it. But when you boil that back down to the question here of like, how do you shape your quality of life, your sense of purpose? I think that's where you have to really look at it and say, okay, how much value am I placing on it? And it can be good or bad, right? We come back to the nonprofit example. I'm going to help save the world. Therefore, I'm willing to make, 20% of market rate for this because I'm saving the world. Cool. That's okay. And if that fulfills you every single day and the financial limitations that places on you don't weigh on you, then that's great. That's a trade-off worth making. Again, I don't mean to pick on teachers so much, but teachers are just a great example of this. Teachers, very purpose-driven, tend to want to make an impact, make a difference, but they experience high levels of burnout. The compensation isn't great compared to a lot of other opportunities. And, for them, the discount rate often was not steep enough when they got into it, and they realized 3 or 5 years in, this just isn't worth it to me. Like, I love what I do. I love the impact I'm making, but I don't love it enough for the sacrifices that I'm having to make personally to do it. And I think that's just a really, meaningful thing to keep in mind is it's okay to misassess it, right? But you do have to fairly assess it when you go into it. There's a spectrum where there's enough money that you'll do any job, and there's a spectrum where there's not enough money to do any job. And you just need to be mindful about where you live in that continuum and what the opportunities before you are.
We're talking about it as if it's a trade-off, but there are also like for-profit jobs, right, where you make decent money that have some of these ancillary benefits. Like, I think we try to add one in like community involvement here, right? Mm-hmm. Can you just speak to like that a little bit more, and if at all, how that improves people's day-to-day?
Sure. I mean, this comes back to sort of the mission-driven, purpose-driven thing right here at My Wealth Planners. We are super focused on the Longmont community. We volunteer an enormous amount of time to local nonprofits for events, for committees, boards of directors. We donate a substantial amount of revenue from the practice to various nonprofits and causes. We are very engaged members of our community. We like to show up. We like to be present. We like to be hands-on. And I think of that as a perk. I recognize also that there's a person out there who'd be like, wow, I don't like volunteering my time at all, and I don't care about any of that. I just want to put in my 9 to 5 and leave, and we wouldn't be a good culture fit for them. But I think for a lot of people who want to be community-driven, impact-driven, it is a good fit. It is a perk or a benefit there. But I'll zoom out from your example here and give you sort of the hypothetical here, right? Imagine you have your exact same job, your exact same compensation. Everything is the same. Your work life, everything. But somehow, magically, your job is to solve world hunger, or your job is to cure cancer, or your job is to make people smile, like whatever you would find super fulfilling. You can't deny, generally speaking, then that like all things being equal, that would probably be a perk or a benefit relative to just doing the job that you currently have. Even if your job is only 10% away from that special thing, there is just value in having that well-established my job makes the world a better place feeling.
Do you think people early in their career should seek that out, or more look for the job that pays the best and gives them the best opportunities to progress in their career?
I have a very generous perspective of the value of work. And it's probably one of the reasons why I'm always sort of like frowny faced on the subject of something like FIRE, the Financial Dependence Retire Early movement, because like I think about COVID, and you have this whole thing of like necessary jobs, right, or necessary workers, and I was like, there are not a lot of jobs that aren't actually necessary, right? People tend to kind of say like, well, my job is important, and they might have sort of a cynical or skeptical view of it, like, would the world really care if I stopped doing that chemical company merger and acquisition activity, at my law firm or something? But I mean, when you really think about it, for example, we work in part to provide for ourselves on the individual selfish level, but also we are paid because what we do provides value somewhere in our society, in that ecosystem. And so when somebody says like, well, would you, like, they talk about it in trade-off terms, would you rather work for IBM in a tech division, or would you rather work for like a nonprofit helping, bring water to arid parts of the world? Well, I mean, this is not to say that working at IBM is not adding value or not making a difference in some way, shape, or form. It's just a little less obvious. So it's something where I look at it and say, hey, you ask the question, should you be seeking out that thing? Be mindful that if you're a traffic engineer, if you're a civil engineer, if you're a lawyer, if you're a doctor, if you are a researcher in a lab somewhere, fundamentally your work is probably doing something to advance some quality of life or some element of humanity. And there's very few jobs that are not doing that, and so it's something where I just want to be a little bit generous about that comparison.
Okay, well, on that comparison, I think you can also make the argument, just because like you could be at a job where you are providing a lot of value, right, but also be like very replaceable, where if you get hit by a bus tomorrow, they replace you in a week, right? And like, do you consider that at all? Like, because like you might have an impact at the place, but the value you provide is also easily as providable by somebody else.
I mean, now we're sort of getting into the like how replaceable are you conversation, and I mean fundamentally the answer is almost everybody everywhere is replaceable, right? Doesn't matter really what your occupation is. Everybody has the capacity to do something, right? And what you do, you may be very good at what you do, but somebody else could also be very good at what you do. I don't think you really need to take that into account so much. I view that more positively in the light of sort of like hey, life is short. Don't give up on the things you want out of life just because you think they'll miss you at work or something. Yeah, this is where I like the fact that people here, for example, typically take about 35 to 45 days off a year. I like that. I like the fact that people are going on ski trips, taking vacations with their families, seeing the world. I think that's important. I think it's valuable. I think that's a good quality of life thing for people to keep in mind. But I don't think we need to spend a lot of time in sort of the nihilistic, I will eventually return to dust, and if I were to be hit by a bus, they'd have somebody in my seat tomorrow. Like, sure. But like, how do you live? How do you do anything with that? What does that inform, or what does that create, in terms of value or quality of life for you to dwell on?
Fine. Last question here. I think it's an interesting one. You just mentioned like ski trips and going on, vacations with family, etc. Like it's kind of evident here, at least, right? And we're a smaller team. We kind of know everybody, right? Like I can tell you, your spouse's name and Steph's spouse's name and like, the kids and stuff, right? Like, do you think that's something that needs to be considered when you're looking for a job? Is like how much are you sharing like personal things with colleagues versus keeping like work separated from your personal life? And is there like a right answer, or is it more of just a preference?
I think it's sort of that expression, it's a feature, not a bug. I think being able to build good personal relationships with your colleagues and your team is a positive quality of life element. Not everybody has the benefit of working with great people, right? And not to be judgmental or anything like that, but I think back to when I worked at Target, and I'm not sure that I was going to be greatly benefited by like getting closer to people I worked at Target with, for a variety of reasons, but some of them were lovely people. All that to say, I think it just depends on the culture, it depends on the environment. You might work with some really, really sharp professionals who are not great people. You might work with some great people who are not the best employees. I think you have to weigh and balance that, but I think all things being equal, you're probably better off having good relationships as part of your working environment than kind of not. There's the Ron Swanson joke where he says, like, I have a best friend. We worked together for 5 years at this place. I still don't know his name, and we don't talk sometimes. It's a funny joke, but I don't think Ron Swanson or anybody else in the world would actually be happier for not knowing the people they spend so much time with. So,
like, if somebody came to work here and was, like, not sharing, like, very, private, didn't share a lot of things, would you encourage them to be more open, or would you just kind of say, oh, well, they're shy, that's how they are?
I mean, culturally speaking, I would encourage them to, but I don't say that because that's the right answer everywhere for everybody. I say that because we have such a tight-knit community as a financial planning firm, as a practice. Our friends become clients, our clients become friends. We've been described as family. I've had half a dozen clients try to put me in their will. You get close with people, so it would just be very culturally weird to have somebody who had like a very kind of mercenary clock in, clock out mentality about their work here.
Cool. Well, I think that helps.
Well, Daniel, I think there's something you've learned this week, hopefully, that you want to share with us. I'm gonna front run the normal ending question here, though, by also just calling out your recent recognition and accomplishment. And maybe that's what you've learned about, but I'm gonna put you on the spot here to tell us about your great achievements recently. Sure.
I was given the award of Employee of the Year by the Longmont Chamber of Commerce during the Business Excellence Awards last week. I guess at the time of this recording, 2 weeks ago, give or take. But yeah, no, I think that kind of just goes back to the community involvement thing, right? Like, I moved here at this point almost 2 years ago, and I didn't know anybody. And like, I'm sure if this job was not community focused and it was just the job, I still probably would have taken it and done all right. And that would have been that. And it's funny because I say that now, and like people come to visit me in Longmont, and it's funny because like we'll always run into somebody, and they'll be like, "Dang, like it seems like you just know a lot of people here." And it's like, yeah, no, I do, because a big part of my job is just being involved in the community. So I go to the gym, I see somebody, right? I go to eat at a popular restaurant, I see somebody. I'm walking on Main Street, I see somebody, and usually like people I actually enjoy seeing. It's not like I look the other way. And I don't think that's something that you can really quantify as a value or compensation when you're looking for opportunities and jobs. But I think it's one of those things, the more effort you put into it, the more you benefit from it. And I think it's something that, having now been here for 2 years, is something I deeply enjoy, that I don't think I would have recognized nearly as much when I had started the position, even though I knew financial planning, you tend to just be more outgoing and work with a lot of people anyways, because that's kind of the job. But I didn't think the community part would be as impactful as it has, which has been neat. And it's nice every once in a while for other people to notice that. So I got that going for me, and it's cool. So I appreciate it.
Yeah, I mean, I had a very similar experience when I moved to Longmont. I worked at IBM for 3 years, where I very much had a kind of 9 to 5, go to IBM, do your work, go home, play video games, or hang out on the weekend with your friends or something, but not getting involved in the community in any serious sense. Where Longmont, it might as well have been a hotel to me for a couple of years. And when I became a financial planner and I started getting more involved in the community and being more involved, yeah, I'll just say very broadly, like, what a much more fulfilling life I've had since I started doing that, since that was part of my life, versus just the 9 to 5 work is just a thing I do for money version of life.
Yeah, I mean, I know more people here than I do back in my hometown of New Jersey, right, where I lived for longer than I lived here. And that's not because I don't like anybody in New Jersey. It's just because I know my friends, right? But like, I couldn't tell you who owns the local bakery and pizza shop, or who holds this position in the community and stuff. But I can tell you a lot more of that stuff about here, just because I took the role of actively participating in the community, which is interesting.
Yeah. Well, with that, now I'll put you on the spot to answer the usual question of the week. What have you learned in the past week or two that you'd like to share with the audience?
Well, that was kind of it. Like I think I learned like the more, like I wouldn't have been able to account for how impactful being involved in the community is prior to working here. But now having been doing it for 2 years, I think it's something I'd like to continue, whether here or somewhere else in my life, just because of the non-monetary benefit I think it provides you in your life. And that's not even like just a financial planning thing. I think there's a lot of people that would probably benefit from doing more things like that, regardless of what they actually do for work.
Certainly. Well, hey, you heard it from Daniel. Get involved in your community. It pays dividends.
There you go.
The Science of Wealth is produced by My Wealth Planners, a registered investment advisor in Colorado. The theme song is This Is Your Time by Dan Phillips. The podcast is intended for educational purposes only and is not investment advice or any other form of advice. Not all material discussed on the podcast is appropriate for every individual in every circumstance, so you should consult with a certified financial planner, tax professional, or legal professional as appropriate before attempting to apply any of the subjects, strategies, or tactics discussed on the podcast.